John O'Keefe, what is our ongoing obsession with serial killers?
It's mad, isn't it?
It's just extraordinary. It just keeps on and on.
I would say it's been going on for years, probably since time immemorial. People have been interested in it. And I think there is one common denominator about the interest, and that is because sexual serial killers are considered to be the worst of the worst. So they're bringing every form of psychopathology, every form of social, environmental and familial factors into this horrendous character. So it's the worst of the worst. And yet they appear to have normal lifestyles, relatively speaking. So they've got the wags, they've got the wives, maybe one girlfriend, and that's it. And they love the dear old mum, sort of in the craze sort of way. You know, we don't touch anybody at home, but then when they go out, they're busy on their missionary complex or hedonistic complexes or whatever it might be, clearing up the world of problems, vagrants, homeless people, prostitutes. At least that's how it used to be.
They scare the living daylights out of us, basically.
They do. And people like to talk about them. I'll tell you who really likes to talk about them. Maybe you can help me with this, Nicola, is females. Over the years, I have noticed whatever series of courses I do, whatever classes I have, the serial killer class, bang in the middle, is the one that's going to attract not only the biggest class, but I would say 95% female. This obsession with ultra-masculinity and hyper-masculinity. Now, why are you smiling? You're not obsessed with
No, I'm not. No, I'm over
Good.
serial killers.
Yeah. I think we all should be over
But
them.
I used to be really interested in them when I was younger.
Yeah, do you know what? I was talking actually to a class about it the other day, and we were just chatting about this very thing, and I was trying to explain to them. As you know, I'm a sort of an official old fella now, and I can remember back in the 70s in Ireland, just to give people some cultural idea of what went on. Now, don't take this the wrong way, but there was always a man in the house, right? So we had an insurance man, Mr. Flood. Shout out to Mr. Flood. You know, we had Barney the bin man. We had Charlie the paper man. There was a man for every season, and they would just sit there supping tea. It was normal for men who were entire strangers to walk into houses, just as it was for men to walk down the street and say, "You're beautiful. I'm a model agent. Would you like to get some pictures for a true crime magazine?" And I think you have to get into that cultural milieu that was there at the time that no longer exists. So serial killers have had to reinvent themselves, but so have law enforcement, unfortunately for them. But that was how it all worked. So it was normal, of course, and that was the 2 decades of titillation, carry-on movies, Mrs.
But women were more vulnerable. You mean?
Yeah, women were absolutely more vulnerable. And if you think there's misogyny abounding now, and there is, you want to be around in the 1970s. It was endemic. And in fact, unfortunately, because females and women were so at the sort of upper end of that misogyny, they almost bought into it because they had to, because it's part of the cultural zeitgeist at the time. But there were people hitchhiking on roads. I said that to my own kids, or at least you don't have to hitchhike anymore. One of them said to me recently, "What's hitchhiking?" Well, it's when you stick your thumb up and a stranger gives you a lift. I mean, the very idea, I mean, I don't know if you remember growing up, but there was 2 things on the side of the road you always remember. It was people hitchhiking and another group of people getting sick. Nobody could seem to travel in cars. Everyone got sick for some reason. Car sickness was a thing in the 70s.
What do you call that? And the cars.
Suspension or whatever it was. But that was a different culture and a different time. And of course, this was perfect for serial killers. Not within the Irish context, obviously, more particularly across Europe and more especially, of course, across the United States.
In the States, yeah. So all of that fed into it. And obviously, I suppose that prostitution thing, and they do repeatedly, they did certainly go for prostitutes.
Absolutely.
Both male and female.
Yeah, both male and female, or male and females who were primarily females, but male also, as you say, who were seen to be somehow loose in their morals. I mean, the irony of it couldn't be more ridiculous. But, these were people who, it's a bit like, now we worked on Graham Dwyer many years ago, and 9 years ago actually now. And it's a bit like, I brought 3 people into the world, I can take 1 out. That kind of idea that serial killers have, that I'm doing society a favor. I mean, these people won't be noticed, and I will have a pleasurable relationship with them, for want of a better term, and then I will kill them or do what I want with them. And post-mortem behaviours and post-mortem paraphilias, well, they're just kind of what I do, and people have to get used to it. So there's you see, every criminal has a news peg. The worst of the worst has a news peg. You remember Anders Breivik, the spree killer. All he could talk about was that he was really upset the Protestant ministers were wearing jeans. I mean, go figure. I mean, I don't know about you, but I don't get cross with my local rector if I see him in a pair of Wranglers. But everybody needs that news peg, and serial killers more of all. So it was always, I mean, obviously they were able to increase their body count by simply going for people they felt wouldn't be missed. But also there was a sense of, I'm doing society some good here. In that warped psychopathology, that I'm doing something that's relieving society of these people who are of no benefit.
And then there was also, whenever they were caught, it was almost a competition for fame and for what their body counts were.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what you do notice in those interviews across the 70s, and of course they're more famous ones we've seen with Bundy and so on, was that they'd like to leave it open. Arthur Shawcross was another one, and they would kind of leave open, Maria, that there was another 20 or 30. Of course there might have been, but you're right, there was always this kind of rush to who was the worst of the worst. And, people are surprised when they hear serial killers being interviewed saying, I actually don't remember. But they don't, because it's like having a cup of tea. Like, there's nothing to it. So, of course, we jump in with our relatively normal psychology, and we jump into there and we just can't understand it. But for them, it was quite normal. And also, sorry, just one final point about that. One thing about serial killers is long before they've committed their first serial killing, they've committed hundreds. And by that, I mean in their head. So they've acted this out hundreds of times, will have had deep inner, personal, younger lives that are beyond the beyond. So their first kill, as they call it, isn't even a kill. They've already done it.
So they go for the vulnerable, or they did go for the vulnerable, and largely in sort of highly populated countries. Like Ireland has no particular history with serial killers.
No, we don't actually. I was just thinking about this. We don't. I mean, there's arguments about, you can go on some of the lists and you'll see that Ireland has 4 serial killers. Another one says 9. Another one says none. We actually don't really have. So first of all, serial killing, 2 or more persons by the same offender in separate events. Okay, that's the FBI definition. There are other definitions to go to 3, 4, 5, but the FBI one is more or less the one that we stick with. In which case, we have people who are English in Ireland who have, I'm not saying Irish people are great by any means, I'm just saying it's peculiar, isn't it? That
we're going to throw it at the Brits.
Yeah, the Brits, I know, since everyone's talking about them at the moment. So Mark Nash, of course, is infamous Grange Gorman killer, and Kieran Kelly is the other way. So we've got an Irish man in England who's throwing people literally under the underground and enjoying it, and the deceit and manipulation involved around that. Then we've John Duffy and David Mulcahy, again Irish, in England. At least 3 women were murdered, highly sexualized murders. And then, of course, we have one actually who came to my attention recently in Ireland. Again, they're English, but they committed their horrors in Ireland. John Shaw and Jeffrey Evans, of course, who people will know, particularly because Jeffrey Evans died in 2012 of sepsis. But John Shaw is still alive very much, and he's served now 48 years in prison. He's had a couple of day releases. You may well have discussed him here before.
Only for hospital, I think, visits.
Yeah, he had. I think he had. I could be wrong. I thought he had one proper outing, as it were. Maybe not. But anyway, he's been out a few times. I met him. I won't say in the context. I've met him quite recently. And I don't want to get cliched about this, but despicable.
And their plan, I think, was to kill a woman every month or something in Ireland. They came purposely for that.
They came purposefully, and I mean, we don't need to go into it here, but the horrors of what they did were extraordinary. To the 2 women, they did murder Elizabeth Plunkett and Mary Duffy. So they had it all well planned. They were getting other people on board. They were talking about it. They met a guy in Mountjoy Prison, and they roped him in. And they were absolutely on a voyage to commit mayhem and destruction.
So what was going on when you get 2 individuals coming together? It's a separate thing, obviously, a totally different thing to having an individual operating as a lone wolf, 2 together.
Well, it's quite unusual having 2 together. You see, okay, so bottom line is all these men are psychopathic, right? All bar none. With the exception of the disorganized serial killers, who by definition get caught very early. So these are people who are of genuine mental health illness, like paranoid schizophrenia, bipolar, and so on. So just leave them aside for the moment. For want of a better term, the organized serial killers are all psychopathic. Now, the thing about being psychopathic, which we've discussed before, of course, you wake up in the morning and you don't think you're a star in the universe. You think you're the only star. So it's quite unusual for men who are undoubtedly psychopathic to get together and to be able to do something together because they have such impulsivity. Very often they can't even work together. They just work on their own sort of bizarre agenda. So that is unusual.
Obviously, have to work out who's boss in that situation?
Well, no, there'd be no working out. If they're suffering from antisocial personality disorder, they're both bosses, and they would. So inevitably, the relationship would implode, and that may be, and I don't say this lightly, but that may be why there were only two. I mean, there were other reasons they were caught, but there were things that led to them getting caught, and so you might say, well, that's because they were, in fact, just very. They couldn't deal with each other for too long. That's the issue with psychopaths. So it is unusual. So that's an unusual couple. Of course, in terms of the media, creates a great story. Sean Evans. And, the big story, of course, about John Shaw. What do people know? If they know anything about John Shaw, he's the longest serving prisoner in Ireland. And he's got a parrot called Jeffrey, named after Jeffrey Evans.
Right.
I don't know if the parrot's still alive. I think it is, actually. He's got a parrot in Arbour Hill called Jeffrey. Like, seriously. So people remember that stuff. But how they got together, well, criminals get together. But yeah, it's unusual.
So they come to Ireland and we just don't have the landmass maybe that you need.
That's right.
A couple of murders happen. We know from the missing women that, that very quickly really sort of sparked an investigation to see was there any connections between them. We don't have the population, we don't have the landmass for them really to hide in this country.
We don't, and you just don't get away with it in Ireland, also because of our culture, because we talk and we gossip. And I don't want to get too generalised here, but we do. And we tell each other everything and we see each other at mass. Literally, it's such a different culture to the Dust Bowls of the 1970s and 80s in
the UK newspapers America. Used to call Ireland the leaky bucket because everything would leak here before in the UK.
And we know in the north, I suppose what you might say about the north and paramilitaries is so little actually did leak, considering we are the leaky bucket. But yeah, I think so. And nobody has, there is still in Ireland, there is no culture that will accept those type of killings. I'm not saying they accept them in the United States, but because things are more out of control there on so many levels, certainly when it comes to law enforcement, contagion and sort of sneaking admiration, hybristophile women, and indeed men who are really attracted to this uber and hyper masculinity as they see it, kind of feed into it. We don't have that here, thankfully, because it's a small society as well.
Yeah, and the UK have had their fair share of serial killers, but again, the population there is so big that they were able to operate, and mostly within vulnerable communities where they go for their victims.
Yeah.
But things have changed hugely for the serial killer. You said there a while ago that they have to reinvent themselves.
They have to reinvent themselves.
It's just between the advances in forensic science that happened since the 70s and 80s, plus, CCTV. There's very few places you can go without it being discovered where you were. And other kind of electronic devices like our phones, which sort of really follow us around. So is the serial killer a thing of the past?
Well, interestingly enough, you would be inclined to say, surely the figures have completely dipped. And okay, they have dipped, right? So just to look at the figures across the states, let's take the states as an example. So the peak period for serial killing in the states was the 60s, 70s and 80s, peaking in 1987 with 414 serial killings that year.
Oh my God.
Now, so the graph is interesting because it's not quite the triangle you'd imagine. You'd imagine it started from a low base, hit a massive peak in the 70s, 80s, and now has gone straight down. That's not the case. It's far more level than you'd imagine. So it's down at around, it's coming in at about maybe 50% now, as opposed to the 70% percentile back in the 70s and 80s. So it's back to where it was, with the exception of 1940 when it dipped in World War II for maybe obvious enough reasons.
And are you talking about convicted and solved murders there, or is it this an estimate of how many people are dying?
So you're right to question that because it's a mixture of both. It's a mixture of both. So we're only estimating here, but it does give us a sort of a trend and a flow. And the flow is, to quote Mr. Adams, they haven't gone away. And they haven't. They're still at pre-1960s, so 1950s, 1930s, when we had plenty of serial killers. They're still kind of at those. So how is that? Like, how are they still maintaining a presence in the United States? Well, you're right to point out the things that are all against them, which is basically CCTV, communications and so on. But actually, that's also what's to their advantage. so they can find people, they can isolate them, they become more victim focused. They know where they're going to be at the exact moment, whereas they wouldn't have known 50 years ago. So actually there's a bit of a balance going on there. And because you, and I use this with heavy quotes, only need to kill 2 people to be a serial killer, they can do it. I think, I haven't got the stats for, when we're talking 10s, 20s, 30s. My understanding is they have fallen all right for fairly obvious reasons, those ones you outlined. But still, people are capable of doing it because, yes, the advances in IT means they're going to get caught, but actually it also helps them as well. The question is how much? Probably not as much as it doesn't help them, if you know what I mean. But
so they're nearly all men.
So here we go again. Quelle surprise, as Rodney might say, every criminal's a man. Okay, you'll tell me, Docus, yeah, there's 145 women up there, and good luck to them. And then I go into Mountjoy and the 795 or whatever it is. So men, and when it comes to violent crime, men. But there are some female serial killers, and they are an unusual bunch insofar as their motivations are rarely, if ever, sexual. Now, I know what you're going to say. You're going to turn around and say Aileen Wuornos. Actually, with those 7 men she murdered, there is now being worked on that. Actually, okay, there was a manifestation of sexual anger, shall we put it. But at the same time, was that really her motivation, or was it the power and control and domination that she wished to reassert all over these men? So yeah, there can be a sexual element, but it's normally, as we know, profit, revenge. And they're much rarer, because if it's revenge and if it's profit, you're probably only going to do it once and see if you can get the money, cash out, whatever. So they're not doing it as often. They fall under a thing called serial killers generally do, but specifically females under a thing called the Kelleher typology, which kind of shifts them into black widows and various descriptions of them killing their own. And of course, Munchausen by proxy. The art is formerly known as Munchausen by proxy now, factitious disorder.
Which seems to... the certain occupation.
Yeah, so they're much more about, in around maybe 70% might be involved in what we could broadly term poisoning. So there's no sort of...
they place themselves in medical environments?
Medical environments, the vast majority are placing, as we know from recent cases, and they're placing themselves in paramedical positions. You're not getting doctors doing it. I'm not saying doctors wouldn't do it, but you're getting nurses, nursing assistants, and so on. Maybe a bit lower down the paramedical scale, and they are in charge of children. And maybe Beth Tinning was one. She had 10. One of her children died of natural causes, and she saw the attention she got, and she decided she better kill all the rest of them, and she did. And she's, I think she may have died since, but she was due for parole in 2013. I'm sure she never got it. But
more recently, we've seen the Lucy Lefby trial in the UK, which was shocking. A medical nurse that was pretty much killing kids and wards, sick kids, and the same thing there. Was she getting attention?
Yeah. You see, when you say attention seeking and you attach it to something as serious as serial killing, people go, oh, that's not, it is attention seeking in extremis, obviously. Like, it's not like our kids going, how am I looking? Am I pretty?
Yeah.
We're not talking about that. We're talking about something much deeper, which is embedded into a personality disorder and probably comorbid disorders, but most certainly what used to be called borderline personality disorder, or emotional dysregulation disorder, deeply buried in that, and perhaps antisocial as well. It's very unusual to find it in women, but I'm sorry, not that particular personality disorder, but that it would lead to that. But attention seeking is interesting because that keeps coming up in research in the last 10 years about serial killers generally, the contagion of the joy of attention seeking. You think about it. If you murdered somebody in the States and you were a serial killer in the 1970s, you got the front pages. They were all yours. You got to fight for your place. What is the front page anymore anyway? What is it? Is it a podcast? Is it a radio show? Is it a thing called a newspaper? So you've got to fight because guess what? We're all famous now. And so it's a much harder act to follow, if you like. And these people do think like that. They want to be more than a footnote in history, or at least a footnote in history. And if you're a healthcare assistant working in a regional hospital in the UK, you probably, if you're unsure of yourself, you want to really improve your legacy. And you just keep denying, by the way. As they say in Dublin, denial is not just a river in Egypt. And it's not. You just trump it out and I didn't do it. So we see with her parents, for example, Letby's parents are sticking by her because you just get into that zone. Also, you can't believe it.
But you can't believe that your own has done such a thing. But going back to the men and some of those disorders you've mentioned, they're what sort of, I suppose, joins them is the fact that they probably are all suffering from multiple different disorders.
That's right. Yeah. So you see, again, students do love when you come in, you say, right, that's the one for crime. That's the one for being mean to your mammy, Yeah. But of course, the reality is, and we see with criminals everywhere, you're looking at multiple areas. And when it comes to personality disorders, you don't typically just have antisocial personality disorder. So we'll call it psychopathy. They're not the same thing, but we'll call it psychopathy. You don't simply have that. You will have other comorbidities with it, one of which will potentially also be borderline personality disorder.
And explain a few of those kind of...
Well, I think the ones, you see, there's certain groups, there's 3 clusters in personality disorders. As far as crime's concerned, we tend not to be interested in cluster A and B, which are suspicious and so on. We're interested in cluster B, which is emotional and impulsive personality disorders. So they're the ones that criminals tend to hang around, or at least those conditions hang around them, genetic primarily, but also socially and environmentally induced as well. And they will be things like, we've all heard of this dark triad. So we begin with your ordinary decent narcissist, that would be me, Nicola, scoring 0 to 9 on the Hare scale. A little bit of a whiff of sulphur about me, but no more than that. So I might enjoy people's attention, and most men would be like that, let's say, for argument's sake. So they'll enjoy people's attention, but if they don't get it tomorrow morning, that's okay, they're fine. They won't burst into tears and they'll still go into work. But then you move into the sort of criminal end of things, beginning with narcissistic personality disorder, scoring 10 to 19 on the scale. And these are people who crave your attention. So if they don't get it, that's a problem. So it's going to be an interpersonal problem for them and potentially a problem with you. It doesn't have to manifest in criminality. You could be called a Kardashian, of course, and have narcissistic personality disorder. And then you move into the next range.
So you're saying you're okay with a narcissist once you give them attention. If you stop giving them attention or you challenge them, that's when you have a problem.
Yeah, you have a problem. But I mean, you don't necessarily have a criminal problem. So remember what narcissism is, right?
We throw narcissism around.
We do.
A lot,
so let's understand narcissism. Narcissism is the marriage of a super inflated ego to catastrophic low self-esteem, right? So let's not just hang around the super inflated ego bit and forget the other half of it, which is the most important, because it's built on sand. That's the point. There is no self-esteem, but there is this contrived superego, you see? So what do you do with that superego? It can't go anywhere. So it goes into obviously negative behaviors.
And one is because of the other. So basically the superego is because people just don't, that the low self-esteem.
Yeah, well, chicken or egg. Yeah, I know what you're saying.
Because people don't understand how amazing you are.
Yeah, they don't understand. Well, first of all, you don't believe you're amazing. So, people often say to me, psychopaths, but I bet they go home and cry in the evening. No, they don't. But we're not talking about psychopaths now. We're talking about narcissistic person. Those type of men, let's call it a man for the moment, is more likely to be engaging in that self-hatred and so on, because they know they have no self-esteem. They want it, so they inflate it out of all proportion. And their disorder helps them do that, of course. So, and then you move into the higher grade then, malignant narcissists, Machiavellian narcissism, which is scoring 20 to 29 on this Hare scale. And these people are seriously difficult to live with. So they've
more of the ego and less of the low self-esteem.
Correct. So and what they're doing is they're demanding your attention. So we've moved from enjoy, say me, right up to crave, and now up to demand.
Have you done the test on yourself?
I certainly have not. My many children advise me I'm definitely top end. No, they don't. They say I'm coming along very well with counselling. So when you go up to that malignant end, now you're looking at maybe politicians, the Alistair Camels, the Dominic Cummings and so on. A lot of them get tarnished with that they're evil and manipulative and deceitful, but they can show occasional moments of genuine remorse and empathy. It's rare, but they can do it. But then you move into the full-blown, which is psychopathic, which is 30 up. To be fair, it's 27 is the entry point. And these men are showing, not only do they demand your attention, but they're going to destroy you along the way. And they won't be going home crying in the mirror. Like they're not doing a Bill Cullen every morning, looking in the mirror going, today I'm going to be somebody. They don't need to build themselves up. They're already there.
They know.
They're already there. And they live according to rules. They're just not yours. So you be careful with them because...
So a psychopath is the top end of the narcissism scale. Are there two different things that they have going on?
Yeah. So you would say, so if you looked at it in 3 batches, it's sometimes called the triad, the dark triad in pop psychology. And it's quite an interesting way to remember it. So at the beginning, you've got the narcissistic personality disorder. In the middle, you've got the malignant or Machiavellian narcissist. And at the top end, then you've got the psychopath. And that's the best. Now, there is only 1% of the general population who are almost all undiagnosed psychopaths. So it's a very small group. So when you think you know one, chances are you don't.
Yes. Now, is it similar for a narcissist? Because
now, as we move down the scale, you might. So certainly when you're looking at, for example, malignant narcissism, there is some evidence, and look, it's not hardcore research, but there seems to be some evidence that is more entertained within the business community. So perhaps in the middle, upper management levels, you may start to see it more. The reason you don't see, by the way, despite the common trope out there, you don't see psychopathy in CEOs is because to be a psychopath, you've got to have a serious level of impulsivity. Serious. Like you don't live in the moment, you live in the instant. Now that works to a point, and you can have a team around you, and sometimes you can get away with it for a period, but it's far less likely that a full-blown hair psychopath is going to occupy that position. A malignant narcissist, yes. Because remember, it's a spectrum of behaviours. So you're going to get somebody in Dublin's inner city who's high on the violence, but low on impulsivity. Somebody from somewhere else who's high on impulsivity, but low on but they've all got it. It's like a mixing desk. And if you push them all up to the max, it explodes. So what they do is they subtly move those things in their lives as best they can within their personalities. And of course, the final thing, which all criminals do, and people with these conditions, is they exhibit shallow emotions. You know, they'll pull the tears. Like, you know, we've discussed this before. Joe Riley on the Late Late Show with Pat Kenny, trying to cry, doing his best, but it's like a second language to him.
But they've learned it.
Well, they know how to do it, but it's like you speaking French. If you start to speak French now, I don't know how good your French is, but no matter how good it is, you're going to take a second, aren't you? That's what they're doing. Go, oh, time to be sad, split second, and you know it, like you did with the Mick Philpott even, press conference, which some people may remember from about 10 years ago, when he took the lives of 5 of his children. He was there with his wife, and he's thanking everybody, including, by the way, Irish travellers who had given him €10,000, which he then, for the funerals, which he then spent in a karaoke bar. I kid you not, over 3 days. But anyway.
That was a fire in that house.
Yeah, so he set a fire to the house. Of course, he had a news peg as well, by the way. I know we've gone off on a bit of a tangent, but he had a news peg, which was that he loved his children so much he wanted to win custody for them. And he made some elaborate excuse. That's why he set fire to the house. But during that press conference, just to get back to shallow emotions, not a tear. It's worth watching. If listeners could watch that.
They're on YouTube.
It's there on YouTube. It's only 2 minutes long. Just watch it. And watch how he actually makes some remark in the middle of it when he's trying to cry. He keeps putting his head down and no tears. He'd even like to thank Irish travellers, as much as to say, like, I'm so much better than them. And, so it's a classic example. You get it, by the way, if you don't mind me just saying something about this. You got it with two very strange people. You got it with Anders Breivik and Graham Dwyer as well. So Anders Breivik, who we remember is a spree killer as opposed to a serial killer, killed all those children on Utoya Island back in 2011 and those people in Oslo beforehand. He cried in court. The only time he cried, though, he laughed, by the way, when all the evidence was coming about how he killed the children. But he cried when they said to him, when they put up his PR video that he'd put together on the Knights Templar, he burst into tears. Oh my God, he was stowed some oash, Graham Dwyer, lower lip wobbling when they put up the fact that I can't remember, he came third in a model airplane competition. That was part of the evidence. And he got emotional. He laughed when they talked about all the horrendous crimes that he was alleged and indeed did do. To his poor victims. But those shallow emotions are important because you can't get through life without them.
Like Graham Dwyer was a wannabe serial killer. He just, thankfully, was stopped before he didn't.
I've talked about this before. Graham Dwyer has all the psychological characteristics of a serial killer.
Break them down. So we have narcissism, we have psychopathy.
Yeah.
What's this borderline personality disorder?
Well, look, the key one is the compulsion to kill. So you will get men out there. So sadism is another one, right? So you will get sadistic men out there, and shame on them and go talk to your priest, but you will get them out there. You will get men who have fetishes, the most bizarre fetishes you can imagine, the most bizarre inner sexual lives you can imagine, but they don't have the compulsion to kill. Now, that's sometimes called a somatic or a bodily manifestation. You hear it in 2 main groups. You hear it in sexual serial killers and you hear it in child sex offenders. They talk about it all the time. time, which is it's like this urge they can't get over and they have to do it. And Graham Dwyer firmly fitted into that because his evidence was all about there's nothing he could do about it. He tried to create a story around it as to why he did it, but the evidence all seemed to be I couldn't do anything about it. I just had to do it. So that's the key issue then, is that compulsion to kill. To be honest, sadism.
And that compulsion with him grew.
Yeah.
He looked as if he was kind of getting what he needed, sick though that was, out of this kind of lifestyle where he was stabbing. Poor Elaine O'Hara was one of the people when he was this was his sexual desire to stab somebody.
Yeah,
and that grows and grows.
Exactly.
And we saw it from his writings because, of course, he wrote stories and he
extraordinary stories.
Stuff that he's talking about. It's growing into, it's not enough just to stab and to leave the victim alive.
And that's the problem. So the problem with these men, the problem with people like Graham Dwyer is they've done it all before in their heads. And then they do it and then it's not enough. And then it's not enough, and then it's not enough. And I mean, we're talking more generally now about serial killers, but it's just never enough. And you'll see it. With all serial killers, leaving aside Graham Dwyer for the moment, it gets worse and worse and worse. And then it gets very casual towards the end. So it seems to peak about 2/3 of the way through, the most horrendous. And then the latter ones tend to be just, I couldn't be bothered anymore. And tend to be less maybe obviously pre and post-mortem behaviours that would shock. And
I thought what was really strange about him was that he was prepared to travel. He was in touch with a poor girl in the United States who had mental health problems at the time. And he was planning to go and to kill her.
Oh, yeah. That is amazing. Again, the problem is, I suppose, we jump at it and we just think, but how would any normal? And then you have to stop yourself.
Yeah.
Oh, he's not normal. And he isn't. And I don't mean just to say he's insane in the legal sense, because he's certainly not that. But he's certainly, his worldview is so different and tunneled. Think of a horse with blinkers. I mean, he doesn't get it. There's no side view going on. There's no peripheral vision. And he's just going over to the States and he'll do it. And he also doesn't care about getting caught. You've got to understand this. Like, Graham Dwyer is not. No, he doesn't. He really doesn't. And they don't. They're put out a little bit. And yeah, if you were to give them life outside rather than inside, they take it. But they adjust very quickly. Remember, they're living in the moment, in the instant. So every day is a bit like that. You just get up, you deal with it. You just have another event over here, another event over there, another bit of deceit, manipulation. And that's all presumably going on in prison at the moment. And they just carry on regardless. But they get really bored. Because of their impulsivity, they get really bored. They buckle under questioning actually quite easily in the end. They'll get caught for a burglary or for something small, and you'll find them just folding. We've seen the TV, and they'll just fold, and you'll ask them why. Arthur Shawcross is a good example. Why? I just got bored. I wanted to go to bed. I want to get some food. And he means it. He did just get bored. Even though you think, well, surely you'd put away the food for a side to try and get away with it. Nah, I couldn't be bothered. I'm bored now. I need to move on to the next extravaganza. I know I'll be the king in prison.
So, but they do cover their tracks as much as they possibly can, so as they continue living this life and killing people.
That's right.
But and they're quite clever, some of them, obviously, in doing that. So when you say they don't mind getting caught, it's like just the game is up and it's going
it's the boredom factor of it all. The game is up. They know the game is up and they just can't be bothered reinventing themselves yet again not to get caught. But don't forget, the primary reason they weren't getting caught in the 70s and 80s and 60s was because policing was just nothing. I mean, and United States.
It wasn't as connected, I think, as it is.
It's not connected. Law enforcement was not connected across the states, the individual states, let alone across countries. So they could just do it with impunity. So that's why we had so many disorganized serial killers. Disorganized serial killers was an early category that was used to describe the wild-looking fellas. You know, here comes Johnny with the mad hair and the one tooth. And he's just crazy, proper old-fashioned crazy.
Yeah.
And he's going to kill you. And he's going to be disrespectful immediately, but walk away. He's not going to bring any implements. He's going to pick up whatever's there. He's not going to necessarily engage in lengthy post-mortem behaviors. He's certainly not going to come back and revisit the body and all of that. So there were quite a few of them. Then they disappeared as policing became better, became more organized, and those organized killers now are going into a smaller group again and trying to adjust to society. But there's an argument to say some of them are adjusting and their psychopathology is now traveling into spree killing because they can't do that anymore, but they need a hit. So they'll go into supermarkets, back to schools, and all the rest of it, and just randomly kill. There's some discussion about that. I mean, we don't have any evidence of that, but it seems like a reasonable prospect that a lot of the men who would have serial killed before, and there would have been a sexual element there, so that's not there now, have to get that immediate fix out of going into supermarkets.
And I suppose it was probably the 70s or thereabouts, or the 80s, when the behavioural science unit was set up by the FBI, when it was understood there was a need to kind of profile and understand what was making these people tick, that this was a big problem in society, and understanding it was going to help us identify them.
Yeah, I think that's for the reason I'm smiling when you say that is because there is an awful lot of literature out there which says that profiling is rubbish. It doesn't exist. It's junk science. And I go some way to that. Good profiling is good police work. That's what it is. A good policeman, a good policewoman is a profiler. But they did sort of put it into a kind of a profession or a sub-profession. And
that's really when they started talking about these behavioural issues, and when we started to sort of mix, I suppose, policing with psychology.
That much is true. And I think psychology takes you some way towards catching a killer, but I think it takes you far more understanding a killer. So I don't think it's as good as it pretends. And I'm a person involved in teaching it. I don't think it's good. It's as good as it pretends to be, and as if we're all mentalists going around the place.
But we do have this craving outside of people working in policing to understand it.
Oh yeah, that's different. And for sure.
Is that a self-preservation thing, which brings us back to all these women at your lectures when you talk about this?
Don't say it like that, all these women at my lectures. So what are you asking me? They're somehow...
is it a kind of an instinct we have that if we can understand what they're like, we can see what's coming at us, we can recognize...
Yeah, maybe a bit of that. Almost, but funnily enough, Nicola, I think there's an element of we kind of don't want to understand it. In other words, we want to, with students I've noticed, they want to understand A and B, but let's leave C alone, shall we? The bit that we don't understand. And that's the word we call evil. And that creates the constant interest. Like if we were able to genuinely, parse it all off and say it's this, this, and this, dare I say it, podcasts, radio shows, books, articles may not be as prevalent. But we actually can't do that, as a matter of fact. And I don't think people want to do it.
Do you mean we just can't cope with evil?
Yeah, no question about that. It is extraordinary. And sometimes I check myself, and I happen to be a minister in my church as well, so I have to check that evil word as well. The things we can do to each other is amazing. You know this, and I know this, and people listening know this. It is extraordinary. It is inexplicable on so many levels that I think people almost, and I use this word carefully, but enjoy the fact that they can't understand it. They want to understand it a little bit, but I think they ultimately know that there is a bit in the human condition that defies belief. Now, of course, in another podcast, I'd be chatting to you about God and suffering. We're not going to do that now, but there are sort of spiritual and transcendent explanations for it as well. But in the real world that we live in, the secular world we live in, it's just inexplicable. Man's inhumanity to
Is it too frightening for the brain to kind of
way too frightening
totally understand it? It's just the brain can't go.
Oh, there. I've heard stories, and I'm sure you have as well. And I actually you're utterly desensitized to it, because if you were to take it on board, you couldn't. You couldn't believe what was done. You couldn't cope. So what you do is you just park it over there in nothing to see here. Let's move along. And occasionally you tip around it and try and explain it and stuff, but you never really get into it. And I think that's the draw as well as the repulsion is in that ultimately inexplicable nature of human behavior. We're great in this country and programs are great, particularly in RT, but everywhere, talking about we just need to, the word kindness is thrown around with real abandon. We just need to be kind. We're so kind. That's the Irish. We're kind. No, we're not. Humans are not kind, and the Irish are no more kind than anybody else. And we do have that side to us. We're not, interestingly enough, though, and I suppose this is where people are really interested, it's not the sum total of anyone's part. So you can go out and be a serial killer, and you can kill 8 people horrendously in all the ways we know. But actually, you can actually be nice to your wife, and you can actually be kind to your children. What the hell is that all about? Like, that's the bit
not
people...
the narcissism, because a narcissist will see a wife and children and the family unit as being part of them.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I'm not saying the motivations are particularly angelic. No, I'm not saying that. But I'm saying they can present as quite kind. And that might be the odd thing that a person does, even that person you're talking about who just sees everybody as an extension of themselves, which seems to be genuinely kind and nice, and whether it is or not, it does say. What I'm saying is, that's the interest. The interest for us is that people can behave normatively and commit abnormal things. That's the bit we can't get our head around. But what we have to get our head around is that we're all made up of these constituent parts. Some of us more so than others, and there's a whole multiple set of reasons as to why we behave in the way we do. And there isn't one thing, although obviously we talked a bit about psychopathy here today, but there isn't one thing. And, there's a great study with Jim Fallon, who's a neuroscientist, who really brings it all to a head when he brings it down to, he is a psychopath. He happens to be the world's leading expert on the science of the brain and psychopathy. But guess what? He was loved as a child. He was absolutely loved, and expectations were given to him. Jim, you're the brightest guy in the world. You're going to do really well. And it's the Troy Deeney explanation. Troy Deeney, by the way, you're looking at me going, who the hell is Troy Deeney? Former captain of Watford Football Club, who came out and said, you do what you see. So there's lots of influences that happen after it, good and bad. But ultimately, there's a multiple set of reasons as to why people do these things.
I suppose we could go back actually to this borderline personality disorder. Heard it recently in a diagnosis of an organised criminal in the Netherlands. We don't tend to hear those sort of diagnoses or psychiatric reports being done on a lot of organised crime, because I think a lot of people, when they're caught, they plead guilty and they go through. So there isn't this kind of big fight, and it's not about... It's more factual, I think, organised crime, isn't it? It's easier to understand in a way because it's a business.
Absolutely.
But, and there's a lot of very horrific murders and etc. goes through it. But that borderline personality disorder, and this is what I wanted to ask you about, psychopathy and narcissism. Can people who study the brain see that there's a disconnect somewhere? Can they see it in the same way they can?
So that's a good question. And it leads on to so many other questions, but let's just deal with that. So the brain. So we've got two areas of concern and interest. That's the prefrontal lobe and the amygdala. Now, what has been noticed in the brains of both living and deceased diagnosed psychopaths is that for many, not for all, but for many, there can be structural differences in the amygdala and or frontal lobe. And there can be communication differences that aren't normative, right? So when they do their electro EEGs, they can see that there's a difference on a living one, obviously. They can see that there's a difference. Now, that's incredibly interesting, isn't it? Because that takes us into a whole new area of, well, sure, look, if they have this in their head, say a lot of them, let's for argument's sake, 70%. 70% of these men have a brain deficiency. I mean, we're very sympathetic to brain deficiencies, aren't we? And we wouldn't be having this discussion about anybody else with a brain deficiency. Why are we having it about psychopaths? Why are we pushing them over into the corner and saying you're despicable, you're incurable, there's nothing we can do about you, when we know there are physical manifestations of it? And surely we could move towards that, not curing it, obviously, but at least understanding it and then maybe dealing with it. And I suppose that's a really good question, which you get from students a lot. And there's actually a really good answer to it, I think. And the really good answer is quite simple. It is that when we look at true mental health illness, as I call it, such as paranoid schizophrenia, the worst mental health illness you can have, that person will make really bad decisions for everybody else and themselves. A person who is, quote, suffering from psychopathy will make really bad decisions for everybody else, but really good ones for themselves. So in other words, within the structural and or communication failings of the brain also clearly lies an element of choice. And it's that element of choice that allows us to distinguish between them and those suffering from, as I call them, true mental health illness.
That we've so far recognised, maybe.
Yeah. Well, of course.
It's always developing.
Of course, it's always, and we only are where we are. There'll be a different conversation in 300 years' time. But I'll tell you what there won't be, unlikely to be, is somebody saying, listen, here's a pill now, you'll be all empathetic in the morning. You'll be grand.
Yeah.
You'll have a bit of no remorse in there now in the morning. Just take 2 of them a day for 2 weeks.
Don't goddamn forget to take them.
Yeah, don't forget to take them. No. I mean, obviously, criminals get medicated, but that's a different type of medication.
So on the borderline personalities disorders, so again, that's a scale.
Yeah, it is a scale, not quite in the same way as the Hare scale. So first of all, it's better to describe it in its newer version, which is emotional dysregulation disorder. Because borderline can give the impression you're not quite there. You know,
I always thought it was quite...
I know, yeah. Like, it doesn't really have sometimes he's a borderline. No, it's not like that at all. Okay, so let's just get populist for the moment here. Think Amber Heard, right? So Amber Heard was diagnosed with the borderline personality disorder, emotional dysregulation disorder, we heard, during that trial. In fact, she had a subset of it, by the way. She couldn't just have that. No. She had to have histrionic personality disorder, which is the sexualized version of it. And basically, the best description of emotional dysregulation order is love you, hate you, love you, hate you, love you, hate you. And on it goes and on it goes. So you flatline with the regular life, you seem to be getting on with things, and then an event is created. A bar mitzvah, a graduation, whatever it might be, a confirmation, a communion. We're coming up to communions, Something might be created, and something's created out of nothing, attention-seeking drawn to yourself, and then back flatlining again.
Do you mean somebody who always ruins an event?
Yeah, well, I'm just giving that as an example. I mean, first of all, you have to remember that when we're talking about personality disorders generally, these are people who have difficulty living with themselves and others and never learn from previous mistakes and consistently make them. So that's the best way to think of when you think of emotional... Now, how it manifests it can be certainly with males who have it in events. So if you think of the scenario of, say, a couple who've split up and he was abusive emotionally and or physical, he's having multiple affairs, he's just the worst father on earth. Like, he's never there for school dates, but or picking up or whatever it might be. But you can be damn sure he'll be there for graduation, he'll be there for the shows in school, he'll be there for all of it, and he'll make it all about himself. Now, of course, that could be connected with other issues, but it almost certainly could be connected as well with that particular personality disorder. It is slightly more common in females, it seems.
The histrionic now, or the borderline?
Well, histrionic also. Men sexualizing themselves is a different concept, but yeah, they could be.
Histrionic sounds like it should be just somebody who just keeps getting hysterical.
Again, you see, the terminology is useless.
Yeah.
In the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and they're still using terms that not only dated, but don't describe the condition well at all. So
histrionic is...
Histrionic is just just to net it down, is that it's more than this, but it's the sexualized version of that condition. So you're using your sexuality. So it's the bad girl. Now, I'm just using populist terms. What you might consider the femme fatale of old. Somebody who is just, treating men with utter contempt. Now, there's more to it than this, obviously, but how it might manifest is like that. You're treating the opposite sex and you're using your sexuality to lure men in. Come into my parlor, said the spider to the fly, and in you come and boom, you're gone and you're ruined. So it's the behavior we normally associate with men, by the way.
Do people go and get themselves examined to see which one you have?
In their right mind.
That's what I was wondering.
Well, first of all, you're not in your right mind because you've got this condition, right? Nothing can be done about it other than... You see, the problem with personality disorders is A, you've got to admit you've got a problem, and B, you've got to genuinely go into therapy and want to do something about it. It's just not going to happen because you're never going to do that because you're incapable of doing it. That's the nature of the condition. So it's a very difficult one to deal with.
How did Amber Heard...
Oh, she put herself forward for it, of course, which, by the way, some will do as well because it's Showtime, So that was all part of Showtime. So there's a bigger issue there, but typically they won't. And it's not. Look, it's not a No, we're being a bit flippant about it here, but it's not a diagnosis that you really want. To be fair, because it does create a nightmare for people, and you see it in the criminal world a lot, but you also see it outside the criminal world, and people have desperate lives because of it. The reason people are, I suppose, less sympathetic to it is because these people can come across as really irritating, really self-serving, and really attention-seeking. And they are all those things.
Difficult people.
And they'll ruin you along the way as a partner, and they won't care if it's a woman or it's a man. They'll just treat you whatever. And everything is a problem. Everything's an issue, and nothing's ever allowed lie. There's no sense of comfort or settling or anything like that. The personality is completely riven morning, noon and night. It flatlines for a bit and then it's off again. And the real example is where you see, particularly in females, is with friendships. The friends are just burned at the stake. All of a sudden, your best friends since school, you've been bullying since school, but they've hung on to you, and then they burn you. And then a week later, they're back, I love you. I don't want, So it's this kind of manipulation and deceit that we see in psychopathy, you see a lot of as well. And you can see how all this, by the way, fits into criminality, can't you?
Completely. Yeah, and you can see also that the sort of the serial killer, the spree killer, that they're at the very, very, very
top end
of that sort of triangle or the tree or whatever you'd call it.
That's right, yeah.
So, and of course, says we don't scare people half to death before we finish. But what is the chances of an individual coming across somebody that's so dangerous that they could kill them?
Well, it's a bit hard for us to call it here, but let's give it a go. So if we go back to the upper end of that triad, so psychopathy, only 1%. And the likelihood is if you're, and I'm just using this term because I can't think of another one, a middle income environment, and you meet that 1% in that middle income environment, the chances of that person being a physical danger to you is probably less likely. No, I'm not saying it's unlikely, but
There's another percentage involved in that.
That's right.
Of that 1%?
Precisely. So you're talking a fraction of a fraction. However, of course, people who are in abusive relationships, physically abusive relationships, will know about this. The malignant narcissist, or somebody who is maybe a narcissist but has other factors that they can't control within their personalities, are far more likely to be dangerous. And if they're used to violence, then obviously that's the biggest warning that you've got. If people use violence as their language and they don't use pro-social communication skills, like everybody in prison doesn't, well, then you've got a problem. But the percentage of people out there, to answer your question, is 1% at the top end. When we're looking, by the way, at personality disorders, although they are enduring and lifelong, you're probably looking at about 10% of the population, which is significant. But I think, guards often say this to me, you know it when you see it. You see behavior and you go, okay, that's different. That is different behavior. And I think we all know it as well. The problem is falling in love. The problem is if you fall in love with somebody, you start to forgive them. You become the nurturing partner. If you're a female, the nurturing woman. You don't know Tommy like I know Tommy. Tommy detaches your retina, breaks your jaw and ruptures your spleen, and Tommy offers you a cup of tea and he might as well have given you the World Cup. That's called intermittent reinforcement, and that keeps females, for example, in abusive relationships. The issue is not why do these women not leave these men, it's how do any of them, how are they capable of leaving these men so badly have they been deconstructed? So these women know all about these men, but it's still a small minority, but you could be attracted to them. Why? Because they have the whiff of sulfur about them. And of course, they're hugely charming. Hugely charming, to the point that you will not only be swept off your feet, you'll be brought out to sea. You'll be brought to the top of the mountain. They're known as Lord of the Rings. All this can be yours.
And so would somebody that is like that and maybe is sort of embedded in a relationship where they are, coercively controlling a partner and being really nasty and physically violent and all that, if you is that satisfying enough for them if you took them out of that? Are they capable of far more to strangers?
Well, they're certainly capable of continuing it. I mean, that behaviour doesn't stop. So what happens is then, well, let's assume that situation you so described there, the man is out having an affair and he's love bombing over there. So he'll be doing that 6-month love bombing that he did originally with you, and now he's doing it with somebody else, so he will continue in the pattern. And yeah, the more he can do, the more he's going to do it. Absolutely. The more opportunity he gets.
Is that a particular personality type that conducts that kind of hatred within a relationship?
Yes, and that type of would be somebody who's falling within the dark triad. No question about that narcissism, malignant narcissism, psychopathy is in there. There's no man or woman who consistently physically beats or emotionally coerces their partner who isn't in that triad. Now, there might be some exceptions who are injury, trauma as a youngster, some brain issues, so on. That's a possibility. But generally speaking, they will fall within that personality disorder deficit.
And that's the choice, or that satisfies that.
Yeah, but I mean, it's never satified. That's the point.
Within the relationship.
Yeah, but it's never satisfied. Remember, they're enduring. So they can peter out, but that's to do with getting old. So your episodic intervals will be longer between how long it's going to be before you have another event. By the time you're in your 60s, you're going to see it rarely, but you're still going to see it. And you're going to see it in verbals. You mightn't see it physically, but you're going to see it. So it's never ending. So that needs to be satisfied, however it's satisfied. But people just tend to burn out or die early because many can have suicidal ideation and or not care, so they may well decide to take other people out with them. I mean, we haven't got time for it here now. We might talk about it again. This whole idea of stalking, though, and the mind of the stalker, particularly.
Oh, I think we should talk about that because this, it is, look, I can see why people and women go in their droves to those lectures because there is something very fascinating about it.
You're interested in the stalking one.
We do, with interest in stalking, but interested in the whole psychology really of it. And I mean, we only have to turn on Netflix and we can see all the various programs that have been made and documentaries that have been made. And even there's an ongoing interest in those sort of, I suppose, most severe from that, your triad you're talking about, that have committed their crimes years ago, might be long dead. We're still interested.
Oh, we're very interested. And look, a couple of if you want me to just say a couple of things about that, is one of the first things is stalking nowadays is a very movable feast. Kids talk about, oh, it's stalking me, I'm being stalked. You know, we're not talking about that. There's nobody who stalks somebody else in the way we're talking about it who is emotionally stable. You don't cross county, state or country to stalk somebody and suffer from or enjoy a normative personality type. You just simply don't. These men are hugely dangerous. Who are the more dangerous? Well, if you were to give the pecking order, it'd be the love obsession or the previous intimate stalkers. These are the ones really to be concerned about. Why? Because they know you. And by the way, they were stalking you within the relationship as well. You know, people don't get their heads around that. Oh, you have a relationship and then you're stalked afterwards. You were being stalked all the way through. When you look back on it, you know, you realize, actually, he stalked me once the love bombing ended. And in fact, the love bombing was stalking. It was power and control that he doesn't have. And these men will typically be narcissistic personality disordered men at the very least. At the very least.
There's so many damaged humans, but definitely let's come back to the stalking. So John O'Keefe, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.